So my name's Charmaine Fraser. I work with Linda at Mind the Gap, and I'm a support coordinator. So my job is to help people to understand the NDIS, to understand their individualised budgets, and to conceptualise increased self-direction and choice and control. In my spare time, I am parent to 2 teenagers. One is an NDIS participant, and we self-manage his NDIS plan. In working with Linda, I think we share a passion for improving the lives of people with disability. I would say that I'd use the analogy that Linda is a big picture person, a visionary who sees nothing but blue sky and possibility and bright kind of balloons of hope and aspiration. And I'm somebody who's a bit more down to earth. So I feel like I go around tying your balloons down to stop them from floating away. So we're kind of a bit, 2 different kind of people, but we're both really shared passion. So.
Yeah, thanks. We're a bit yin and yang.
There you go.
But that works really well. So Mind the Gap started 5 years ago with a really simple idea that people with disabilities should be able to self-direct their support, maybe with the assistance of family, but they should be able to self-direct their support and live the life that they choose. It's a really simple idea, and that's sort of really where we were founded. I'm also the parent of a 26-year-old man, and now he's just started living independently of me. I left home, but he's got some housemates moving in soon, and he's an NDIS participant, and he's said that he's happy for me to talk about his goals and some of the creative ways we meet his support needs. And once again, we also self-manage, so we've got that sort of flexibility that we need as well.
Great, thanks ladies. So in terms of understanding the links between goal setting and your NDIS plan, there's really a couple of steps involved in that, developing those insights. And so our webinar, we've structured it into 3 different areas. The first will be getting started, and it's really important because there's some key NDIS principles which flow through the whole process of goal setting, and then how your funding comes to be. So that's important. The second issue is how to link my goals to my plan, and we will talk through the mechanics and some key issues there that will help create those links. And then the third part of our webinar will be how do you actually sit down and write the goals. So that is going to be the structure, ladies, of how we take on this task and this challenge. So getting started, there's a couple of newbies in the audience. So about 50% of people with us this evening have NDIS plans, and that means that 50% haven't. So we really thought we'd kick off with some of the basics. And Charmaine, the first question will be for you, and it's really around what is the NDIS eligibility criteria?
Okay, so there's really a few main points. The first is that you're under the age of 65, that you're an Australian citizen or permanent resident, that you live in an area where the NDIS has rolled out, and that you have a permanent and significant disability, or that you would benefit from early intervention. The NDIA have eligibility lists, so we'll provide links to these because that might help you to understand. And I just thought I'd speak to 2 of them. So list A is the conditions for which are likely to meet NDIS eligibility under Section 24 of the NDIS Act. So these include things like intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder levels 2 and 3, certain levels of cerebral palsy, spinal cord injury. It's actually quite a list, quite a lengthy list. So you can Google, or we'll send you the link to eligibility list A. There's also B, C, D and E. But I thought I'd speak to list B as well, because these are permanent conditions for which functional capacity of variable and further assessments of functional capacity, there's a buzzword there, is generally required. So these can include, and you might be surprised to know, conditions like Down syndrome. So Down syndrome is not automatically, does not automatically meet the criteria for the NDIS. Autism spectrum disorder level 1, multiple sclerosis. And again, as you scroll through that list B, you might be surprised about what turns up on that list. So we can give you the link to these different lists. You can have a look through, and I guess understanding where you might fit on those lists But really the words that I'd like to highlight there are functional capacity. It's not so much about disability, but it's the impact that that has on functional capacity across the domains of, let me see if I can remember them, communication, social interaction, mobility, learning, self-management, and self-care.
Right.
So that's my very brief answer to eligibility criteria for the NDIS.
And I think the important thing there is the functional capacity, which is going to flow through and be one of the themes that we will carry through all 3 sections of the webinar. So that was important. So Linda, once we know that we're in the scheme, there seems to be a lot of confusion about what are considered NDIS goals versus non-NDIS goals. So can you give us some idea of what might be considered NDIS goals?
It's not really a matter of what's an NDIS goal or what isn't an NDIS goal. They're your goals.
Yep.
But it is a matter of what the NDIS might say is more appropriately funded by another sector. So, for example, if your goal is to get at your HSC and go to uni, the NDIS might say, well, that's the education department's responsibility. You might get some funding with transport, or you might get some funding with self-care, but the actual education part will be looked after by the educational institutions. Similarly, if you required, if you live in public housing or social housing and you required home mods, then the NDIS would say, well, that's Department of Housing's responsibility. So it still might be a goal of yours, but it's not going to be funded by the NDIS. Okay. Yeah, so the NDIS call this the interface with mainstream services, and there are some contentious issues, particularly around health. There's certainly some gaps in New South Wales between what the NDIS will fund and what the health department will fund, and it's really unfortunate that people find themselves in those gaps. And I think at the moment the NDIS and the health department are duking it out to find a solution to that. And of course, that's complicated because health and disability are often very closely related. Language also can really matter here. So if we're thinking about your goals, you might just want to, think about your language a little bit. So for example, an adult who wanted to improve his literacy was told that's an education responsibility. But if you sort of have a bit more of a think about that goal, and it might be to improve my written communication so I can keep in contact with my family and friends and I can fill in forms, then that starts to look more like an NDIS goal.
Right, yeah. Okay, I'm with you. Okay, so that's an important distinction to make. People need to be aware of the different interfaces, but they also need to bear in mind that some of the personal goals might actually not relate to education or health, that they actually might be more NDIS related.
Yeah. So it's good to know about them, and have a bit of a think about where that might fit within the NDIS sector, as opposed to being told to go away to another area which might not meet your goal as well.
Right, great. So now getting into the nitty-gritty, Charmaine, for you, so we know that we're in the scheme and we have a good idea of what's an NDIS goal or what's not going to be covered by the NDIS. How do we know what's actually going to be funded and what's not going to be funded? Because people don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about goals if that's definitely not going to be funded, a goal that's going to be funded by the NDIS. So can you give us some guide of what may be funded?
I can. The NDIS funds reasonable and necessary supports. Now, reasonable and necessary are 3 very important words. It's not just a case of, oh, I need it. It must be necessary. That's what I say to myself when I'm shopping. No, it's not like that. There's a very specific criteria that is set down in the Act, and it's section 34 of the NDIS Act. Okay. It's not a mystery. We can, again, send you a link so that you can understand reasonable and necessary criteria and see how it might be applied to your circumstances. But I'm just going to give you a little bit of a taste of it. So the things that might be funded as reasonable and necessary supports for a participant can include things such as supports for daily personal activities, that could be at home or in the community, therapies, so that could be speech, OT, physio, psych, help with household tasks, mobility equipment, home mods, vehicle mods, certain travel and transport, and help to maintain employment. They're very broad categories. I can tell you what's not likely to be funded. If it's not related to your disability or the impact of your disability, if it duplicates other supports already funded by governments, that's coming back to what Linda just said, if it relates to day-to-day living costs that are not related to your support needs, if it's likely to cause harm or pose a risk to others. These are all stated in that section of the Act. And I just thought I'd talk a few of the keys to reasonable and necessary, that it needs to be related to the participant's disability, to your disability. But, and Linda and I would speak to this, it doesn't necessarily, the support doesn't necessarily have to be disability specific, but it does need to be related to your disability. So there's many ways, and we're going to talk about a few innovative ways to meet people's support needs, but that's just an important distinction, disability related, but not disability specific. It can't include day-to-day living costs. It must represent value for money, and that's an interesting concept in a scheme that takes a whole of life approach. It won't always be the cheapest, which might have been in the answer in the past. It'll take a kind of a lifetime approach to costs. It has to be likely to be effective and beneficial, so expect them to be looking for evidence-based therapies and nothing too experimental. And this is another really important point, it'll take into account informal supports given to the participant by a family, carers, networks, and the community. And we really need to think about age and stage here, because what's reasonably expected of the parents of a child who might be at school age could be really different to the expectations of ageing parents with an adult who might still be living with them. So I'm just going to take a few kind of hard facts, a few cases in point, because I was able to see a few of the questions. The news is things like tennis lessons, swimming lessons, and music lessons are more than likely to be considered day-to-day costs. It's worth raising this in your planning meeting, because people's circumstances can be really different here. So I don't want to say to you the NDIS doesn't fund it, but I am going to say to you they're more likely to consider those everyday costs that a parent would encounter whether their child had a disability or not. iPads. Now, this is one that has changed. In the last 5 years, we've seen iPads go from something that were quite commonly funded in the trial phase of the scheme to now we're seeing more that they're not funded. And that actually comes down to the NDIS taking into account statistics presented by the Australian Bureau of Statistics that said that 62%, or 86% of households have an internet connection, and 62% access that via a tablet. So you're starting to see them kind of look around and say, well, is it an everyday cost now? So, but I've also seen people and heard of people being funded for iPads. So these would be ones that might be used specifically for communication purposes, and they would be justified by an allied health professional who was supporting that. So I'm not going to say never, and I'm not laying down the reasonable and necessary criteria. I'm just kind of looking at examples so that people can start to operationalise that guideline. And just one more popular request, Thermomix. I've seen that knocked back on the basis that A, it's not the value for money, that you can actually achieve the, I've been to a Thermomix party and I've had the bread rolls and the beetroot dip, but they would say that there are more cost-effective ways to meet those various components of the Thermomix, sorry to the fans out there, and that it could cause harm, interestingly, you know, and we've seen that. And actually I've seen them knock back a chainsaw, and that's less contentious. I suspect that probably could cause harm.
Thank God they knocked that back.
But look, I guess I just want to round up that conversation maybe with a positive note that says at Mind the Gap we are passionate about finding innovative ways for people to meet their support needs. And if you want to be innovative, consider self-management, because that's really going to give you the greatest chance for choice and control. And are we allowed to?
Yeah, you can.
So this is the NDIS self-management guide. We're going to send you a link to this. And on page 8, there are very useful questions that answer the question of, can I buy it with my NDIS funding? So there's my hot tip resource.
Yes. Thanks, Charmaine. And it's hard to answer that question in all of 2 minutes, but at least we have some idea. And just to reiterate that this webinar is being recorded, so we will send you a link after the event, and we have also created some useful resources after the event. So we'll send those links to you, and they will be on MyCareSpace under our resource section. Right, so now, Linda, one of the questions that came up a lot from people who registered is, how many goals do I set? And should they be long-term goals or should they be short-term goals? And someone registered today and said, well, I got funding for all my short-term goals, but not my long-term goals. So how does one balance that, the long-term versus short-term?
The really, really funny thing is that the NDIS sort of form that around goals has space for 2 short-term goals and 5 long-term goals. So it's actually a technical issue that means the planner has to slot the goals in according to the slots in the form. Yeah, so there's not a flexibility there. So that planners, I think, really rack their brains, and people come in with their goals and they rack their brains and how they can actually get them to fit in. So there's 2 short-term goals and 5 long-term, medium to long-term goals in the format. I'm going to say that it's actually really hard to concentrate on a lot of goals at one time. And there's some goals that are just going to be going on for a really long time. For somebody who has, has a communication impairment, to improve their communication might take, a really long time, and that might be a medium and long-term goal. My son in the past year, he had 2 short-term goals. One was to live in his own home with housemates. The other was to be gainfully employed in his own micro business, which is a very small enterprise, very small business. We really, he achieved the first goal. We were able to do that. But the second goal we're still on the way to. And it really just, I think, really to me just highlighted that having 2 specific big goals, it's hard to concentrate on that many things at once. Well, for our family anyway, there might be other people who are much more high achievers than we are. But so I think in some ways, thinking about 2 goals that you could probably achieve in the first year is actually quite reasonable. And then having some goals that might take a lot longer to achieve as well. So, you can think about it that way, but it's certainly the reason why people are a little bit restricted is because of the format of the plan
form.
The format of the form.
Okay, so it's just a practical issue, and people need to understand that. Okay.
So you might want to, if you've got more than 7 goals, you might want to see if you can put some together that might overlap. If you've got a community inclusion goal, that might be really related to your communication as well, because going out in the community, you need to be able to communicate. So sort of really thinking about, putting a few together if you're sort of having issues like that.
Okay, all right. And we will come back to this later on in the webinar when we talk about specific versus broad goals. So Linda, we'll touch on that again. So we're now going to move on to the second part of the webinar, which is how do I link my goals to the funding and the supports that I need. So I think, Charmaine, you sent me a quote a few weeks ago. Someone had said that NDIS goals are like a golden thread running through your plan and linking all your aspirations with your funding and the supports. Why do you think that's true, and why?
Linda and I were discussing this, and that golden thread analogy has been around for some time, almost since the early days of the scheme, but it did appear in a post by Valued Lives, who are based in Western Australia. It was on the 16th of October, so we might re-link back to that.
Yes.
So I'm going to paraphrase that concept because I thought they did a good job of understanding or explaining that golden thread analogy. So what they said was, an example of a goal might be, I want to develop my ability to communicate my needs and wants. That's a very valid goal. So therefore the NDIA might fund speech pathology. And we were having a bit of a chat about other forms of augmentative and alternative communication, such as, for me, it was PECS or POD or the eye gaze technology. So it doesn't just have to be speech pathology, but some combination of that. So what the golden thread analogy says is that when you specify your goals and aspirations, the NDIS planner or local area coordinator works to identify the most suitable, reasonable and necessary supports. So we're starting to come back to that reasonable and necessary criteria that I spoke to. So the golden thread highlights that the link between your statement of goals and aspirations and the statement of participant supports is explicit. And it ensures that the statement provides the foundation for the subsequent selection of supports. So the NDIS is committed to paying particular attention to your statement of goals and aspirations when they decide what supports to include in your plan. And before any supports can be funded, they have to be satisfied that the supports will help you in your pursuit of your goals and aspirations. So there really is a very explicit link between those. So you need to see that thread of connection. So often it might be really worthwhile to have one very broad goal that encompasses a lot of different ways to be supported. Something like you said, which is, I would like to live an independent life, or I'd like to participate in the community in ways that interest me, and then be a bit more specific. And I think we're going to talk a bit more about broad and specific goals, but that was just kind of, hopefully, a bit of an introduction to that golden thread analogy.
I just wanted to add, I mean, in some ways, like, you know, it's the NDIS is different to other disability support funding schemes in that it is based on goals and aspirations. So previous to the NDIS, it was all about people's deficits, their needs, and etc. So you know, I still, you know, look at the NDIS Act and things like that and think, well, you know, this is actually nice, really good, solid stuff about you know, people having high hopes for themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's important to today, and is very much about the how to, but we can't lose sight of that good life, Linda, that you're achieving with your son and Charmaine, you too. So following on from this theme of the golden thread, many people ask, how do I write goals that are going to get me the funding that I need? So Charmaine, how would you respond to that question?
Yay, I get that one. Okay, so I guess the first thing I'm going to say is it's just not that simple. I wish it was, but it's not. I say it's a bit like a secret recipe like KFC. So we know that there's a direct connection or a thread between your goals and aspirations and your funding, but it's not the only factor that's taken into consideration during the planning conversation and the subsequent funding decisions. Your NDIS plan is really an accumulation of information about you, and it starts before that. They'll ask you things like, where do I live and who supports me? And the answer to that could be really different if it's a child living at home compared to a child living in out-of-home care, or if it's an adult living independently on their own, or an adult living in shared accommodation. Right. So you can already see that's a point of differentiation. And then they'll look at your daily life. So what actually do you get up to during the day and night? And that would be very different for a young child or an infant compared to a child at school, compared to an adult that might be working, and an adult that might be participating in some type of group or day program. So we've got that kind of the basics that come out early in the planning conversation, and then the planner or the LAC will take into account informal supports, which are friends and family. They'll look at mainstream supports, which Linda mentioned earlier, which can include things like health and education, and then community supports. And let's not forget that people with disability access community supports just like everybody else. Yeah. So men's shed, church groups, surf club, there's all sorts of ways that we're connected, and all of those kind of feed into the conversation. So the funded supports are woven back in a way that helps you reach your goals and aspirations. I hope, if I've got a few minutes, I'm going to explain a few different participants, their goals, and their different funding outcomes, just as a bit of a way to explore this a bit more deeply. So I've got a different collection of participants, different goals, and different funding. So let me talk about my, I have changed names to protect people's privacy, obviously. Privacy, So these are a kind of a version of people's plans. So I've got participant A, B, C, and D. A for Alex, B for Ben, C for Cooper, and D for Daniel. So Alex had 3 goals. One was to manage anxiety and anger, one was to build social skills and communication, and one was to improve confidence and self-esteem. And his overall plan came in and it was $15,000. Then if we look at Ben had 4 goals. His was to increase independence, to build social connections, to be more fit and healthy, and to improve communication. And his plan came in and it was $40,000. Then we had Cooper, he had 5 goals. One was for daily supports for personal care, to build relationships with friends and family, to function in a socially appropriate way, to learn activities of daily living, and to increase social and community participation. 5 goals, $100,000 in his plan. And then there's Daniel. He had 6 goals. One was support to return to education. Second one was to live as independently as possible. Next one, therapy to support activities of daily living. Next one, manage behaviour and emotions. Next one, develop a caring network. And his final goal was to support to access the community and recreation activities. And his plan came in at a total of $117,000. You might think there's some magic correlation between the number of goals and the amount that was funded, but actually that's probably the least. What I'd like to highlight is that these A, B, C and D were really different people with different ages and different life circumstances and different ways that their disability impacts on their functional capacity. So a little bit more that might flesh that out. So of those 4, only half of the participants had both parents supporting them. There was a single mum and I'm pretty sure a single dad. So where there's limited informal supports, we start to worry about the sustainability of informal supports, and you might see funding kind of come in to help bolster informal supports. One of the participants was disconnected from education. So that's a pretty critical mainstream support for most teens. And some of the participants had additional complexity in their lives and involvement with the health system, the mental health system, the justice system, and child protection. So you can see it's not just the goals, because every single one of those participants had a goal that somehow addressed increased social and community participation. But they had different support needs to do so. So, some of the participants might have needed core supports. Maybe that's a support worker to help them to access the community. Others might have needed positive behaviour support to access the community. One needed mobility supports. And I just thought I'd touch on the other, which was short-term accommodation. Yes. So short-term accommodation is the new, the reinvention of the concept of respite. And I know that came up in one of the questions, what's happened to respite? Well, respite was traditionally seen as a support to give carers a break from their caring responsibilities. And in the NDIS, we see short-term accommodation as an opportunity for the person with a disability to have a break away from their home environment, to make social connections and build skills for independence. So you can see there's a reimagining or a reinvention. So really it's a reframing of an old concept that better fits within the scheme. So that was a long-winded explanation of why, why some people get more funding than others.
And it's a complex, it really is a complex area, but I think it's important for people to realise that there's no one simple answer, or there's no silver bullet to, solving that issue of the funding. It's actually, it's so individual, and it's really linked to you and your personal circumstances. So I think we can...
And I'm just going to add something to that with my blue sky dreamy hat.
Blue skies. Blue skies today.
So no, look, I really think it's important that we don't get, funding is really important, and it provides you with the means of getting the support you need. But funding and money won't buy you love, and it won't buy you happiness, and it won't buy you a good life. You've got to think about that separately. So those sort of things come separately to it. Funding by itself isn't the answer. So you can have a truckload of funding and still have, be isolated, marginalized, on the, living in a place where you're not happy. So it's really about thinking beyond, what we've expected from disability services in the past, and, and really thinking about, what's important to you, and getting help to achieve that as well. So, this is big stuff to actually, to get that good life happening for you. So, so.
And look, that ties in with the concept that we discussed in the last webinar, which was post-school options. And it really came down to, well, what are you passionate about? What do you love doing? And then what is the help that you need to get that? So it's really, don't think of the NDIS is the center of the universe. Think of yourself as the center of the universe, and the NDIS can possibly support you in your universe. So, Linda, one of the questions that we need to come back to, because nearly every single person asked this question, is, should I be writing broad goals that give me a lot of flexibility, or should I be writing specific goals that get me the supports that I actually need? So what advice, given that you've probably been through a number of plans yourself, what is the advice you'd give people?
Look, I think what Charmaine said before, having a broad goal that's really tied, I want to live an independent life. I'd like to live, I'd like to be in the community. Having a broad goal like that can kind of really sort of tie in a lot of support under one goal is just really useful, just so you've got the golden thread happening. And then after that, I really think that when we're looking at that idea of having a good life, really just looking at goals that are individual, but I suppose there's a common way that people can express what a good life might be for them. So, that when you ask people what's good about your life, regardless if they have a disability or not, it's having a job and contributing, having some cash. It's really important, earning some money, opportunities to develop your skills and learn new things. So that's sort of, that's really important to a lot of people, to be involved in the community in ways that are relevant and interesting and meaningful for you. To build your skills, I've said that one before, to have, love, to have people in your life who care about you, to maintain your friendships and your family relationships, and have opportunities to develop more friendships and relationships as well. So I'm just making sure that I'm not missing any, to live in a home of your own where you feel safe and secure and belong, and you're actually, it's actually where you can be yourself, so that's really important, to make decisions about your life and how you're supported, and to live your life independently. And that doesn't mean that you have to do everything yourself.
I'd really love to touch on that. So independence versus alone.
Yeah, no. And I read a really great quote by the Dalai Lama the other day, and I didn't write it down, but it was something along the lines of that no one is independent. For everybody, anybody who claims they are, the clothes they wear, the car they drive, all those things that everyone claims, that people use every day, created by a small army of people. So no one is independent. Everybody needs help. And in the same way, people with disabilities can provide help to other people as well. So,
I like that point.
Yeah. So when I'm sort of thinking about goals, I think there's lots of really nice tools to help think about that. The 7 keys to citizenship are really, really good. So I just went through some things that are really, really general. What you can then do is sort of tease those out, and how each individual person expresses that is going to be different. And actually then start to think about your goals from there. So, but really sort of, using those sort of either the 7 keys to citizenship, or, sort of those very common things that most people really want in their life. And then finding how that person, or how you as a person with a disability express that in your own life, or would like to express that in your own life. And then that sort of becomes your goal. And I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, the 7 keys to citizenship, those will mean different things to different people. So again, it's we're not offering a cookie cutter approach. That is not the intention. But some key concepts that you can apply to your own personal circumstances, that's the important thing. So Linda, very briefly, there are a couple of support coordinators that have joined us this evening, and a lot of them referred to SMART goals, and there may even be NDIS participants or parents who don't know what we mean when we say SMART. So can you maybe just take 1 minute to explain and give some idea of how do people write SMART goals?
So SMARTS is an acronym. That's like S stands for specific. I was going to say SMART for a second. S stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So that means that you have a goal that sort of addresses each of those components. If you want to know more about SMART goals, just Google SMART goals, because there's a lot of information. There's a lot of, there's a lot of places and ways that people use SMART goals. The NDIS is wanting to see what, or the NDIA wanting to see what people, the outcomes people are having. SMART goals up front kind of gives you a way of evaluating how your plan has gone at the end, at the review time. But an example of a SMART goal would be something like the goal my son had, which was, to live independent of my parents in a share house with flatmates who I really like within a year. So you sort of have your time, it's achievable, it's measurable, you know, we can see this is happening.
Yeah.
And you know, the other nice thing about it is you can often see yourself progressing towards it throughout the period of your plan. Great.
And it's probably not a bad principle to apply generally when anyone sets goals, right? So they need to be specific and measurable and time bound and all those good things. So, and I'm assuming that for people who have support coordination at the end of the plan period, that actually helps. If you've set SMART goals, it's easier then for the support coordinator to maybe look at the outcomes in relation to the SMART goals.
Yeah, and I think that also you kind of then sort of, you know, sometimes you might, you know, put a year time frame on something and it just takes longer. You know, sometimes when you're sort of starting something new, you're not really sure how it's going to go, but having it measurable, you know, you can even see your progress towards that. So even if you haven't quite accomplished or achieved it within that time frame, you've still got, you know, a bit of a plot of how you've gone towards it.
Okay, and we have seen a number of support coordinators tell us that you may have goals that you expect to achieve in the first 12 months, but you don't, and it's quite okay to carry them through to your second plan. So I think one thing that Charmaine taught me, and I always remember this is not a forever plan. So if this is your first plan, remember it's for 12 months. It's not forever. In some cases, it might be for 2 years or 6 months, but it's not forever. So it's important to remember that. So going back to you, Charmaine, and going on to the third part of our webinar. So we understand what's funded, what's not. What are some of the buzzwords that we need to know? So we're now going to sit down and write these goals. A couple of people have said, what language do I use? Is there NDIA specific language? We call them buzzwords. So can you briefly touch on what some of the buzzwords are?
There's loads. Okay, well, I will. But it is a whole new language. Part of the role of support coordinator is to be a translator. My job seems to be to know everything about the NDIS, and just to make it trickier, it changes all the time. So a bit of a shout out to all the support coordinators who registered and who might be watching this. We've got some resources specifically for you.
Yes.
Disability Services Consulting do some excellent online and face-to-face training for support coordinators, so we haven't forgotten you. But I just wanted to do a little bit of an explanation of NDIS language, because that's an acronym in itself. So the NDIS is the National Disability Insurance Scheme that was enacted in 2013. And we're going to call that the scheme. Then there's the NDIA, the National Disability Insurance Agency. That's the organisation charged with implementing the scheme, and we're going to call that the agency. There's a new Quality and Safeguard Commission set up to improve quality and safety, and we're going to call that the Commission. There's local area coordinators. We might have a few of those registered. They're the front face of the agency, and they would vary from region to region. And they're going to typically be the point of contact for about 75% of participants in the NDIS. Others might see an NDIS planner, and that's roughly, I think, about 25% of participants would actually see a planner that works at the National Disability Insurance Agency. Participant, that's you or your loved one. A nominee is somebody who acts on behalf of a participant. A child representative is somebody who works on, represents a child who's a participant of the scheme. Some more buzzwords. Support purpose. So there is core, capital and capacity, and they're actually doing a good job of explaining that on people's plans and on the portal. So they shouldn't be terms that are hard to track down the understanding of. And then support categories, and there's about 15 support categories, including things like daily activities, improved relationships, which is really behaviour supports, improved daily living, which is therapies, assistive technology, and so forth. A service provider, another buzzword, so these could be either registered or unregistered providers. And we actually discussed those in, I think it was webinar 2, so you can always go back and look at the archives of our webinars. And I'm just going to finish with a few key principles. So the NDIS is about participation. They want to see economic participation by both participants and their carers, social inclusion, which is Linda's area of special interest, choice and control, reasonable and necessary, which we touched on, and ordinary life, which we've mentioned, person-centred, strengths-based. all of this underpinned by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. Whew. So every now and then people say to me, oh, I don't think I need a support coordinator. And I go, really? Okay. But I just wanted to kind of tie back in one more thing when I mentioned those key players, which is that NDIA, the agency charged with implementing the NDIS, has its own goals set down in its corporate plan. So in the NDIA corporate plan between 2013 and 2016, its goal was the purpose of the NDIS is to change the lives of people with disability, their families and carers for the better, to enable people with disability to fully participate in the social and economic life of the nation and to live ordinary lives. So that's pretty powerful. And if you want to get a collection of buzzwords, they're all in there.
They're all in there.
But let me just tell you that that's been updated. So the NDIA corporate plan for 2017 to 2021 states that its purpose is to improve economic and social outcomes for participants, and at the same time as ensuring the scheme's ongoing financial sustainability. So a bit of a reimagining of that. But I guess if you're going to look at your goals, it does help to understand the goals of the overarching
scheme.
And the agency, because there's a plug-in between those as well.
Yeah.
So I hope that's helped some people to understand the buzzwords.
And hopefully you've already heard some of these buzzwords and you're already feeling familiar and comfortable with these buzzwords. But I'll just reiterate, we will be sending links to all these important resources that you can refer back to after tonight. So Linda, one of the questions that we spoke about earlier and we discussed was, this is well and good when you can talk to a planner or an LAC about your aspirations and goals, but how does one set goals for a young person or someone who maybe has struggles with communication or is nonverbal? How do we set goals so that they have a voice through that process?
It's a really good question, and I think that there's some really great resources around to help with this. So for goal setting for people, you know, who maybe are not able to articulate or talk in the same way as other people, one of the goals might be to improve their communication so they can have a greater voice. But nonetheless, you know, you really want the person with a disability to be at the centre of the planning process, regardless of their communication style. Everyone communicates. There's lots of ways. If you know someone well, you know you get to know what they like, what their interests are, what they're good at, what they hate, what they don't like as well. Yeah. So I would really say bring people around the person. So, you know, who know them well. I always, you know, talk about having a glass of wine and have some nibbles on the table.
Nothing wrong with that. We don't have that.
No.
Just water.
Yeah. But, you know, bringing people together with the person with a disability and really, you know, having a bit of a brainstorm. There's some really lovely tools to help with this. There's a path, which is planning alternative tomorrow's hope.
Yeah, there we go.
Tomorrow's with hope.
That's another acronym. There's another acronym.
Yeah, that's a beautiful. You know, so you know, you cover the walls with butcher's paper, and you know, there's a process to go through. There's you know, My Choice Matters has some great tools. You know, you draw pictures, you cut out things from magazines. You just use lots and lots of different ways to really have that person involved and listening to them in the way that they communicate, you know, and once again, you know, it really does come down to having people around who know that person well.
Yeah.
I'm going to just say for anybody, don't think about your goals before you go into the NDIS meeting. Don't just sort of wander in and expect that the planner is going to be able to sort of somehow get them,
draw them out of you. Yeah.
So planning, you know, this planning and goal setting takes time for everybody, particularly if you have communication difficulties. But certainly, you know, having that time, you know, that to really think deeply about it and think what's important to that person. Once again, I'd be sort of suggesting at least one inclusion goal. And yeah.
And one independence
And one
goal.
independence
If
goal.
you're inclusion, I'm independent.
Yes.
So one inclusion goal and one independence goal for everyone, or I mean, is that for a young child as well, or would you say more for a young adult?
Look, I think for everybody, yeah. Like, you know, if you're you're a child, your inclusion goal might be Scouts or Girl Guides or Nippers or whatever, you know, depending on
whatever
that
you like doing,
whatever you like doing, and just taking, you know, if someone shows a little bit of interest in something, it's just sort of taking it the next step, and letting them share their interest with other people who have the same interest.
Yeah.
You know,
so I think one of the things we spoke about earlier was also don't do it on your own. Try and solve part of this problem with others who care about you and love you, and whether it's getting around a table with a glass of wine and saying, you know, what is it that we enjoy doing, and I'm a part of this family, and it's important that I have the supports to continue to do that. So I think we spoke about that earlier. So thanks, Linda. That was very useful. And all those resources and references that Linda's made will be included after the webinar. So Charmaine, again, a lot of people stress around the fact that there's the first plan and then there's subsequent reviews. And a number of people ask, how do you set goals that are going to be reviewed annually, and how do I, what should I be thinking about if I know they're going to be reviewed annually?
So, I mean, I've got two views for everything, because I'm the parent of somebody who, you know, when I go to the review meeting, and then I'm also a support coordinator who goes with many, many people. I was at a planning review meeting this morning. So I literally have just kind of walked out of that. So look, as a support coordinator, when we prepare somebody for their plan review, we really take a step back, look at each goal in turn, and we'll ask ourselves some questions, which is, did we reach the goal, yes or no? And as Linda said, sometimes these are very quick to achieve, and sometimes goals can be ongoing. And so then the next question is, should the goal continue? Because is it just rolled over? We'll often look at what the outcomes of the goal were, and you know, the outputs towards the outcomes, and there's an outcome framework that we can give you a link to. So if somebody was working towards independence, well then did they make progress in, was it travel training or increased activities of daily living, moving out with friends? There's all sorts of either achieving the goal or working towards. And again, if you've got a SMART goal, then you might be able to measure those increments. If it was social and community participation, did you get to concerts? Did you join a group with people with shared interests? It's funny because we prepared our notes separately, but there's some recurring things. We spend a lot of time together, Linda. We're starting to talk alike. And then, you know, did you get to church on a Sunday? There's, you know, all sorts of ways that your social and community participation goals could have been reached. But we also need to be mindful that sometimes we experience barriers to achieving a goal, and there can be many of those. We're working in quite thin markets. So just because you get funded for occupational therapy doesn't mean that there's an occupational therapist just waiting to take your referral and start delivering those supports. We know that people who live in regional and remote areas can have real constraints on supports to reach their goals, and things like long wait lists for assistive technology approvals. So there's all sorts of things that, again, if you can speak to those different facets of a goal and the progress towards a goal, even if you don't have a support coordinator, that's what support coordinators often do in preparing their reports for plan review. And then, based on all of that analysis, then you can look at new goals, because years pass so quickly. I mean, literally, everyone's saying it's Christmas. It is. And so that means that another year has passed at warp speed. And so plans can seem to be slow, and then time speeds up, and before you know it, that year's over. And so you're setting new goals. So, and I'm just going to remind you that plan ahead for those new goals. There's some key transition points: starting school, leaving school, moving out of home. Again, if we just think back to that assistive technology, growth spurts might need re-scripting of assistive technology, as well as orthos, you know, foot orthoses and things like that. So, you know, new goals have to be very...
So you almost need to be one step ahead, right? So, I mean, you need to think about what you need at present, but you really need to be thinking and getting all your documentation or your assessment.
Oh, definitely.
And just on that point, I guess one of the things that we've seen a lot of people saying, well, I got my OT assessment, why didn't I get the supports, or why didn't I get the funding?
Such a killer one. Well, I mean, and again, all we can do is hypothesize on that, which is, it's not just a recommendation, it then becomes a reasonable and necessary funded support that the planner tests with the reasonable and necessary criteria.
And linking back to your functional capacity.
And goals and aspirations.
Yeah.
So it's not just that it was recommended. Again, it's not just, oh, I need it, therefore it's necessary. No, it's got to be reasonable and necessary. There's 3 words.
Yeah.
It's not just one or the other. So it can be it's a very tricky, it's a new world, and hopefully this has helped people to at least understand the language and understand the legislation. Planners and LACs don't typically make mean-spirited decisions. They make decisions that are based in the legislation.
Yeah, and they have jobs to do, and they have guidelines, and they have an act. So we have to be mindful of that. So we do want to leave some time for questions, and people can send in questions. Those of you that have joined us with Facebook Live, feel free to put questions in the comments section, and we will try and answer a couple of those. Both of you are parents of NDIS participants that self-manage, and you both are warriors, the benefits of self-managing, and so is MyCareSpace. We're strong believers that to get the most out of your NDIS funding, self-managing and even plan management will help you achieve it. So again, many people asked, how can we be creative in setting our goals, or what sort of goals are outside of the box? So maybe you both want to just give a little bit of a personal perspective there on achieving.
Well, this is great, because this is where I get to say, I'm the down-to-earth one, I'm the balloon popper. So this is your baby. Go for it, Linda. I mean, look, except that I'm a committed self-manager, and
that's really, look, I think your goal, creative goals. I mean, in some ways, your goals are your own, and they should be based on your interests. So, if what did you know? Sorry.
Do you need to sneeze?
I might. I'm going to keep on going.
You've done so well.
But it could be based. If you start thinking about someone's interests, and my goal might be to join a bushwalking club, take a cooking class, join Scouts, volunteer in an English school, join a circus group, take a drumming class. These could be sort of whatever floats your boat, sailing, so really sort of, that they're very much inclusion goals that I've really listed them. There's a great list of things here, I think is Yellow Submarine Down Under. Inc. has 50 ideas for, for young people to do. So, you might want to sort of think about what might be of interest to you. But the other part of so your goals are creative in that they're about you. The other side of it is how you can creatively meet your support needs as well. And that's, once again, when we come back to self-management. So, so while you're goal setting, you might be able to think about some of the strategies that you could use to meet your goals, which really help if you're self-managing, because you can use unregistered providers, or if you're plan managing. And once again, you might have to talk to your plan manager about that. You don't have to use supports that are specific for people with disabilities that we've already discussed. You might be able to find a way to pay for supports which are perhaps community-based, but meet your support need and meet your goals and are related to the impact of your disability. We can't move away from that. I can't really say what you can and can't have with your supports, because it's so individual. It really is. But if you look at the NDIS self-management guide, I've got that here.
Second flash.
Yes,
our favourite.
Yeah, have a look at page 8, and you can really start to see ways that you might be able to meet your support needs. So it's creative goal setting because they're unique and they're around you and your interests and the things that you want to achieve in your life. It's your goals and your aspirations, but also having those innovative ways of using the support funding that might not be the way the planner had in mind, but as long as it complies with, if you're a self-manager, if it complies with, meaning the criteria in the self-management guide, then it should be okay.
Okay, great. I mean, in terms of just linking that back, it came up in our last webinar. So young people who are making that transition from school, either looking for a job or looking for some post-school options. And one of the concepts that came up was think about what you love doing, what you're passionate about, and then what's stopping you? What are the barriers from achieving that? And could you achieve those goals if you had the support of a support worker? So thinking of it in terms of that way, it's not really creative, but it's creative in the sense of you are putting yourself at the center and then working around what are the gaps you've got to fill.
So one of just to give a really quick example is a man who because of his disability was considered that he'd never be able to have a job. Now he loves walking. He's an active guy. He's now doing, earning money, delivering letterbox drops. Great. So, and he does that with a bit of support, but he's earning cash. So I think that really, for people with disabilities, very often paid employment seems elusive because of the impact of their disability. But we just try a bit creative in finding out what they really like to do, shaping that a little bit, crafting a job to suit them. And there you go. We might have someone in paid employment. And it's not quite enough of that happening yet with the NDIS. Love to see more of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned micro enterprises. There's a couple of projects happening, and I mean, Libby Ellis from Mind Your Business. Minding My Business.
In charge.
Yes, but I think the ILC project that she's running is Minding Our Business, and we're big supporters of Libby Ellison and that project, because essentially it's the whole micro enterprise concept, and you start small, but one thing leads to the next, and the skills that you're developing are really important in those early days, and getting that peer support. So I think that could definitely be a creative goal for someone who is leaving school and making that transition. So, so we now have a little bit of time for some questions from Facebook, and thank you to those people that have sent in some questions. So one of the questions that has been sent in, and maybe I might ask you, Charmaine, because your child is younger, and would a good goal be prepared for starting school, or would you need to break it down further? Would that be a good goal?
No, I don't think you need to break it down further. I guess what you've got to identify is what NDIS funded supports are going to prepare you for school. Is it because all children start school? Kindergarten is quite, it's quite challenging for many children. So you've got to say, what's the nature of the support needs that your child needs to start school? Do they need support building skills for independence? Is it toilet training? Is it, most children need to learn to orientate to their belongings. Sometimes way past starting school. Do they need some way to transition whatever their communication strategy is to school? I mean, this is the tricky one about questions on the hop. I'm going to lie awake tonight thinking much better answers to this one. So would that be a good goal? Yeah. Does it need to be kind of teased out a little bit? Perhaps yes, particularly if you want the supports to land in a therapeutic space, then you'd say, build the skills, or develop the skills, just something that would then tie back into supports. Maybe they might need to work on some positive behavior support to follow instructions. One of the things that some of our kids can have difficulty with the following group instructions as opposed to one-to-one instructions. There's just a few ideas, and if that's how you conceptualize it, well, then the wording of the goal kind of comes from there.
Okay, good. So there's one question that's definitely got Linda's name on it.
Oh, okay.
And it says, are there particular goals that I should have?
Look, as I said, I think, the sort of just a very broad goal that kind of gives you a bit of flexibility. So, with your funding. So we've sort of talked about that a few times already. Yeah. Look, I think that I'm a big supporter of, having an inclusion goal. I would really...
So that's social inclusion?
Social inclusion.
Or community?
Community social, that gets you out meeting people in the community who don't necessarily have a disability. So that's a social group. It could be, there's meetup groups, and really it's about sort of meeting people who share an interest with you or share some commonality. It might be the local area, you know, a local group based on location, a community group based on location. It might not necessarily be around interest. It might be, but it's an opportunity to be there on a regular basis, getting to know people. And so it might be the local pub, but you're there regularly. I'm not necessarily saying that you need to be there regularly. Maybe that's the best example, particularly if you're 5. Yeah, so I think that's always a goal where you're expanding your networks, you're expanding people who know you. And I think the other part of that was really important in terms of safeguards is when you build your social capital. And social capital is just a fancy way of saying the network of people around you who can provide you with a bit of support and resources if you need it. It's a really important safeguard, particularly for people with disability. Quite often the only people they have around them might be paid support. It might only be paid support or you know, and that's it, or other people with disabilities. So really looking for more opportunities there.
Right. So, and just, I guess, at the risk of repeating ourselves too many times, a social inclusion and independence goal. If you're stuck and you're not sure, those two seem to be a catch-all that we can all benefit from, regardless of our circumstances. A very practical question that someone has asked is, whose perspective do I write the goals from? Do I write it from my perspective, as in I, or do I say Nicole would like to become more independent?
It's really, I think it really depends on, you know, particularly if it's a child, you know, parents are often making those decisions. I would think that once you're sort of getting to someone who's older, really trying to engage them in the goal setting themselves. And even if, you know, young children, you know, are also able to, you know, to have their own goals as well, you know. So sort of really, you know, perhaps at an early age, we often ask children, what do you want to be when you grow up? You know, so sort of really sort of, you know, having that a person with a disability, regardless of their means of communication, really having that sort of idea that they're in charge of their life, and you know, and that sort of stuff that's incremental as they're growing older. They're not going to give a 5-year-old control of their life, but you know, as they're 15, you'll be starting to pass over some more of that control and more of that decision making to them, as you would with a kid without the disability. So I kind of call it the apprenticeship to adulthood. And you know, sometimes when kids have a disability, they miss that apprenticeship. So I'd be. Which is kind of not necessarily answering the question, but I think using the person's words themselves or their perspective themselves and working with them around that would be the best way.
I've seen a lot of that. Whether you write them that way, the planner or the LAC kind of changes them into "I would like to." That's the sentence tends to and a lot of the plans.
We have heard of circumstances where goals have been changed and plans, but we don't necessarily want to delve into that right now. That might be above and beyond this webinar. So a couple of other questions. We've got a lot of other questions, but one of the questions that I know we received relates to young people who might be teenagers, where the parents are trying to help the young person set their goals, and typical teenager just not getting a lot of communication. So it does come back to the issue of someone with poor communication skills or limited communication skills. Any tips where you've got either a client or a loved one who's just not giving you much to work with?
We were talking about this. Now, what did you say?
So sometimes it's worth thinking about what's important to the person and what's important for the person. So sometimes I think about what's important to my son might not always correlate with what's important for him. So, you know, and, you know, I think a lot of parents of teenagers might be aware of this is not specifically something to do with parents. But, you know, for a person with diabetes, it might be important. It might be important to them to do their own grocery shopping, but it's important for them that they watch their sugar intake. So it's sort of kind of like a little bit of pulling those things apart. Often with people with disabilities, we've done, this is important for you and yada, 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 and they haven't had much say at all. So it's finding that balance between the two. It's really good person-centered planning, and there's some nice resources around that from I can give you the links to it afterwards. Right. Yeah. So it's part of person-centered planning that you actually think about those things.
And it's a balance, and I think any parent of a teenager would know that sometimes the things that you spend doing for and with your child aren't necessarily the things that they value, but they're the things that they need. So it's a balance. So we probably have time for one last question, and this has come from a person who has an acquired brain injury. So I don't know if either of you want to respond, but it says, the person has said, can I make my goals in my first plan and have them repeated every year automatically? So have a goal that you believe will be an ongoing goal. So just that it automatically ticks over year after year.
Okay, so the answer is, of course, you can have ongoing goals. However, there is no such thing as automatic rollover in the NDIS. There is, there's the plan, the term of the plan, the review process, and the new plan. So there just isn't. We saw a little bit of auto rollover during the end of the trial phase and the start of full scheme, and that was just like overload. Some people got plan extensions, but realistically, this is something that it's good practice. It's good practice to identify your goals. It's good practice to be looking forward and understanding the supports that those goals might need. And seeing that that's a good thing, that gives you control, that gives you foresight into the future, and engage in that process rather than thinking that you just set it and it rolls over. So I would say you can't just your plan won't just auto roll over. There is no such.
So Sam Payer at the MyCareSpace had some beautiful resources around that this morning as well, around your review.
And we saw those.
I know, they were really good.
So but I think that there's some things which it's almost I need support to get out of bed and have a shower every morning. Bang, that's going to be the same every year. If you've got the support needs that require that. But there's some other goals that, I think that in some ways, you might be able to watch your achievements towards them as well. And I think that that's not a bad thing to do. And, I think that actually coming back to the NDIA and saying, well, this is what I've achieved, it's not a bad thing. And I think it can be really helpful for people as well. Right. See what they've done in the past year.
So as you can see, there's no straight answers to any of these questions, and I think an observation for me personally that this webinar has been a really interesting one for MyCareSpace. I mean, you will have noticed compared to our other webinars that we've all got a lot more notes, and we're referring to our notes, and I think that's testament to the fact that this is a really tricky subject, and it's a really, really tricky space. So nobody takes anything for granted, and I think again, one of the key principles that we support at MyCareSpace is no amount of planning will be wasted, and pre-planning, connecting, networking, ask, be part of Facebook groups, register on MyCareSpace. We have numerous amounts of NDIS resources that are freely available for anyone, and we have been extremely fortunate to have both of you, so Linda and Charmaine, join us this evening, and I want to thank you for all your preparation and the notes, and these will be made available after the webinar or together with the recording, and we'll have some useful links. And I would like to say thank you to my other half, who none of you ever see, Bianca Shapiro, who makes all these webinars possible. She's always doing an outstanding job, so thank you. And we wish you all the best for the end of 2018. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to our series of webinars in 2019. Goodbye.